Hey everyone, welcome back to another chess video. So in this one we'll be looking at how to checkmate with a queen versus a minor piece. So this would be a queen versus bishop or a queen versus knight. And this one I still consider a little bit more on the beginner side of the spectrum as far as checkmates go. But I wouldn't say it's as beginner as like, say like king queen versus, a lone king. And it's also a little bit more advanced than like a rook, versus, and king versus a lone king. So this is more like maybe beginner to intermediate kind of range. It's not taught as often because I think a lot of intermediate to advanced players just kind of wing it on the spot. And, it sort of works for them. But I think there's also some value in kind of studying this a little bit more closely, at least so you have kind of a general idea how to do this. So without, getting, too much details, let's just get right into it. Okay, so here we have the first example, which is a queen versus bishop. And this one is much easier, I think, than queen versus knight. And so here, the main thing you have to look for is what color complex is their bishop on. In this case, it's a dark squared bishop because it's controlling all these dark squares. Now, because it's a dark squared bishop, generally speaking, we want our queen and our king to be on light squares. And the whole purpose of that is just because if they're both on light squares, then the bishop literally has no influence there. It's basically useless. And if the bishop is useless, then you can just pull it off like a normal queen and king checkmate, or you might find a way long term to try and fork the bishop and then win it, and then you literally have a queen checkmate there. So okay, so let's give an example of how to do this. So right now this is a dark squared bishop. So our king is on a dark square, our queen is not. So we probably want to advance our king, and get our king on a light square would be best. So we'll advance. Let's say we play king to e4, and then they'll play a move, so they move their bishop back. And so now, again, because it's a dark square piece, I generally want to be advancing on light squares. And so I'm going to play queen to c4. It's a nice slow advancing move. Keeps, on the other color complex of the bishop. So now they'll shuffle again, and I'll slowly make progress. So I'll play queen d5 check. And with both of these, with the queen and bishop, as well as queen versus knight, there's not like an exact pattern that you have to do. It's not like an exact technique. Some endgames, like say bishop and knight, you have to play very, very precise, and there's a certain pattern, more or less, that you have to follow each time. But with this, it's a little bit harder to teach in some sense because there's no exact method. You sort of use the same box idea where you try and corral their king, but there's not like a set exact number of moves that you can play in every single position. It's just, you try and wing it on the spot, and you should be able to checkmate well within the 50 moves. So here, they play king to e7, and again, we're slowly making progress. So now we'll advance our king, again, on a light square, the opposite of their bishop. And so now they're going to shuffle, and they play they play bishop to c3. I'll just show us a short variation. If they would move their king, it's probably going to be checkmate a lot faster. I think a lot of people will say, well, why can't they just like move their king back, maybe to like to e8? And here, I think it would be a very short checkmate. You just advance your king. And, this king is really limited in where it can go. Like, they can shuffle their bishop, doesn't matter. I don't even need to take it, I just ignore it. I'll just play a check, they have to move over, and then this can be checkmate. So you don't always even have to win the bishop. It's really useless on the wrong color complex. But, in some positions you can fork it, and it's not stalemate, then sure, why not take it? But okay, let's go back here. So the actual move, they play bishop to c3. So now I'll play this check, and now I'll fork the bishop, and now I'll actually win the piece. So, wherever they really went, I'm sure it would have been a fork at some point, because the queen is just such a powerful piece. Eventually, you're going to force a checkmate like the variation we showed, or find a way to fork the bishop. So they have to move their king. Now we'll pick up the bishop. And here, it's a pretty standard queen and king versus king checkmate. We'll continue it just a little bit, just kind of show the technique. I'll just slowly advance, kind of push the king further and further back. And then now they're, all the way to the back rank. I'll just cut them off, the queen to c7. And so with queen c7, they're now kind of corralled on that one side. So they move over here. I'll advance my king. And they play king to g8, so I'll just play checkmate here with queen g7 checkmate. Okay, so that was the, one with the queen versus bishop. So now let's take a look at queen versus knight, which is, I think, in my opinion, a lot tougher of an endgame, but still fairly manageable. All right, so here's an example here. So now, the key with this is, unlike the bishop, where, we just dance around the other color complex, knights actually change color of their color complex every single time they jump. So right here, this knight is on a light square, but wherever it moves, like let's say here, this is now a dark square. And then if it like moves again, well, this is a light square. And if it was to jump somewhere else, now it's a dark square. And so it literally changes every single move. So you can't just hide on the same or opposite color complex like you did with the bishop. So how do we do this here? The biggest thing is just avoid knight forks and slowly find a way to make progress, and try and separate the king and knight if possible. Ideally, what you want to do is kind of separate them, because their knight is a really good defender, especially defending their king from checkmate. And here, because we have such a powerful queen, the only way they can basically win, unless there's some really obscure stalemate that you fall into, is basically forking your king and queen. So like right here, if we didn't have a move, then they would just play this immediate knight fork, they would pick up our king and queen. Now there's a little trick that we have here that can kind of help prevent a lot of those forks. And so the trick is, don't have your king and queen on the same color, because here these are both on light squares. And if they're both on light squares, then there's a possible knight fork on a dark square. In this case, it could be on g5 as an immediate fork, but imagine if the knight was also on d2. Well, that would also fork these pieces. And so if we have the king and queen on opposite colors, it is literally impossible for the knight to fork us in one move. So that's kind of a useful thing. You can kind of dance on the opposite side, unless there's like a queen check and then they're forced to move their king. Something like that, because then you know they don't have time to play the knight fork. So keeping that kind of in mind, we'll do the same exact thing as we had before. So now, these pieces are both on light squares. I want them both on the opposite. So I could have the king on a light square, the queen on a dark square, or vice versa. I'm going to play queen to f6, because this is the dark square, our king is on a light square, and there are no immediate knight forks. And this also kind of pins their piece, which it doesn't mean I'll win it right away, but it's just kind of one thing they probably have to unpin. I'll slowly push their king back. So they play king to d7, I'll advance my king, and I'm trying to kind of force them, because if they move their king away, I'm going to win this knight. So we're going to basically have to move the knight here. So they play knight c7 check. And so now I'm going to play a key idea here, which is the hardest spot probably for the knight to reach is when you're kind of diagonally one square away. Like in this case, there's one square diagonal in between. It would actually take the knight 4 moves to get to here. So there's not going to be an immediate check. So like I'll give one example. Like if the knight were to go like 1, 2, 3, 4. We can see that's one route the knight could take to get to those squares. And so it's also a really useful idea sometimes to put your king right there. Similarly, if your king is right next to the knight, like right here. I know it can't because their king is defending, but hypothetically, if our king was on c6, and that was a legal move, it would take 3 moves for this knight to actually check my king. It could look something like 1, 2, there's the check, and then it would be 3 to get to that square. So because those take longer than one move, those are sometimes good places to put your king. So with that in mind, I want to put my king here on e5 or somewhere that's diagonal from this knight, just so it's not going to check me right away or for a while. So I'll play king e5. Their knight is going to move again. So now they play knight to e8, threatening my queen. And so now we'll give a check because it's slowly pushing their king back. And it looks like here they have to abandon their knight, and then I'll pick it up. Obviously, I'll capture the knight. Let's show if they don't abandon the knight. I'm sure it'll be a quicker checkmate. Let's say instead of that move, let's say they go king to d8. So here, what I would do is I would just advance my king. And the problem is they're kind of cut off, because if I advance my king here, this is a really weird spot for the knight, because they're not going to go here because they'll lose it right away to check. And so I'm basically forcing this move, because if they were to move their king somewhere, here's the only legal move, because the queen is controlling all these squares, that would drop their knight right away. So I'm basically forcing the knight to go to c7. But when the knight goes to c7 with check, remember I said the king and the knight right next to each other, it takes three knight moves to get to that square. 2, until I'm in check. So it'd be like 1, 2, and then 3 if my king is here. It would take 3 moves to get to the same square as me. So, with that in mind, to kind of avoid the knight checks right away, I'll play king to c6. And they're getting trapped pretty quickly. Here, I have so many threats. I'm threatening here for checkmate. I'm threatening to win the knight. I'm even threatening this check in some lines, and they just can't stop all of them. So they're going to play knight to e6, which stops a few things, I suppose, but then it doesn't stop queen to d7 checkmate. And so in this variation, we actually got checkmate without, forking the knight. Sometimes it works that way, sometimes it won't. But let's go back to what they actually play, which is a little tougher defense. I'll grab the knight, they move their king, and then it's just a normal queen checkmate at this point. So I'll kind of cut off their king. Now we have this nice box with the box method, and so the king is kind of corralled and probably get checkmated either in this corner or somewhere on the edge of the board. So we're kind of pushing the king that way. We'll go to b6, I'll advance my king. They go to b7, I'll give a check. They go to c8, and now this is actually just mate in 2. There's probably a few different ways to do it. If I go here, this is going to be a common stalemate, so we avoid that. But if we go to any of these squares in the b file, this will actually be a Zugzwang type thing, because if I just shuffle like one square back, they only have one legal move. They are forced to go king d8. And when they go king d8, well, now I have this nice box mate with queen to b8 checkmate. Okay, so that was one example of the knight. I'll give one more example of the knight, just because sometimes you're able to win it a little easier than others, and I kind of want to show some of these common patterns. Okay, so here's our last example we'll show. So just like before, generally we want to keep our king and queen on the opposite color complex of each other. Right now they're both on dark squares. I want one on a dark square ideally and one on a light square, just so that way I don't have to worry about any immediate knight checks. So we're going to play queen to e4, slowly advancing, make sure our king and queen are on different colors. They move their knight, which is fine. And notice, this is what we want. They're diagonally away from us, so it's going to take 4 knight jumps to get to our square. So that's really good for our king. So I'm going to advance my queen now, because our king is perfectly placed. So I play queen e5 check, king goes back to d8, and now I think I'll actually play queen to b5 check, kind of forcing their king to c8, that way they don't drop the knight. Or sorry, c7, so they don't drop the knight. They do go king c7. Now I'll play this queen check, kind of forcing them a little bit more over. That was the only move, so they could hold on to their knight here. Let's go queen to d6. And here, even though we're on the same color, there's no knight to here on b5. And so, it would take them 3 moves to get from where they're at now on b6 to b5 and fork us. And 3 moves, we're going to be, much further away by then. So as long as there's no immediate knight fork, you should be okay. So they move here. Okay, king to a6, that's fine. I'll advance my king. And again, I would be a little bit concerned to my radar that these are in the same color, but here their knight cannot get to here immediately, so there's no immediate danger for the knight fork. That would take 3 moves for them to get from here to here. I actually made a video on how the knight moves, so if you want to know a little bit deeper on how many jumps it would take for a knight to get somewhere else on the board, I'll leave a link to that video at the end. You can just check the video description for that. But here they're playing king to b7. Okay, fine. There was no way to save the knight, it looks like, so now we'll just win the knight. They move over to c8. I'll just cut them off to the back rank. They move. I'll get the opposition. Move again. And then we have queen to e7 checkmate. And just like that, we've checkmated. So queen versus minor piece is not too difficult, but you have to know kind of a few main ideas. So once you know those main ideas, then this checkmate becomes a lot easier to do. But overall, you just have to practice. Put it into the computer and just practice. That way, when you get this in an actual game, you'll have that practice. Because if you can beat a 3,000 plus chess computer when you're practicing these checkmates, then you should easily be able to beat your opponents in a game. They're not going to play as perfectly as the computer. So, I hope that this video was helpful for everyone, and now you know how to checkmate with queen versus a minor piece. Thanks for stopping by, everyone. I'll see you in the next chess video.